Hi, everyone, and welcome to AudioFile's Finnegan's Wake conversation. AudioFile is the #1 source in the world for audiobook reviews, and we are extremely happy to have you here today. We're just giving it a second that we will be taking questions live. You'll notice that if you're on the Zoom, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please type it in the Q&A box, not the chat box, so that we might see it and address it. All right, I have 3 very fine speakers here today, and I'm going to take a moment to introduce them. We're going to start off with Barry McGovern. He is a Dubliner. Acting in both television and film, he is perhaps best known for his appearances in the works of Samuel Beckett. His 2 one-man Beckett shows, I'll Go On and What, have played worldwide, and he played Vladimir in the Beckett on film Waiting for in theaters, TV and film, and extensively on BBC Radio and RTE. She was awarded Best Actress for her portrayal of Nancy in the BBC radio play The Old Jest. Roger Marsh is a composer whose music has been performed, broadcast, and recorded worldwide. He abridged Ulysses and produced it for Naxos, and then went on to produce all of Joyce's major novels for Naxos audiobooks. So I know you're here to hear from all of those people, so I'm just going to leave you with this. We are recording today, and the recording will be available on AudioFile's YouTube channel by early next week. Just a reminder, if you do want to ask a question and you're on the Zoom, please put your question in the Q&A box, not the chat box. We're excited to present today's event in conjunction with the Joyce Center with the upcoming Bloomsday 2021 celebration tomorrow, Everything Joyce. And thank you, of course, to Naxos Audiobooks for sponsoring today's event. We have 2 podcasts that I'd like to point out that AudioFile works on: Behind the Mic, which has reviews, and Audiobook Break. Right now, we are actually doing a special audiobook of David Copperfield as part of Audiobook Break, and that is a recording from Naxos Audiobooks. So we thank them for their continued support. All right, enough of me. Let's go talk to our fine guests here. Roger, I'm going to start with you because you really helped bring this all together as producer. And it's probably impossible to explain Finnegan's Wake in just a few sentences, but if you had to try, how would you describe this book?
It's very difficult in just a few sentences. You're absolutely right. It's not impossible to explain. And I'll do my best. So you just stop me when you've had enough, okay? I think an hour and a half might do it. I mean, the trouble is that Finnegan's Wake is not a linear narrative. It's a non-linear narrative, which is true of many books. But in Finnegan's Wake, you know, nothing goes from A to Z in a simple way. That's true of a lot of books, I guess. In Finnegan's Wake, everything is cyclic. Things go round and round. And also it operates on different levels. So there is a kind of plot, and then there are other plots which are amplifications of that plot, and they all seem to happen at the same time, rather like in a dream. So I'll start with the simple plot, which is, I mean, you know, Finnegan's Wake can be easily explained and often is, and probably is on the sleeve note of the CDs we're producing, which is that the central character is a guy called Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker. It's a great name. His name implies that although he lives in and is from Dublin, he may have connections elsewhere, perhaps in Scandinavia. And this becomes a kind of theme of the book. But anyway, Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker is an ordinary kind of guy who runs a pub in Dublin, in Chapel Izard. And he's even rather well known and respected in the community. He may be standing for election. You know, this is hinted at that he might be up for election for something. But it's all very vague, and also vague is the fact that he seems to have been involved in something in the Phoenix Park, the famous Phoenix Park in Dublin, which may have involved some kind of impropriety. He may have exposed himself to some young girls in the park, but we're never quite sure. And one of the reasons we're never quite sure is because this has been reported by various people, including 3 drunken sailors whose testimony isn't particularly reliable. And so the whole book is kind of about interrogating this idea of whether Humphrey Chimde did something very wrong. And he's interrogated repeatedly and questioned, and people give reports about this event, and it all becomes very confusing. And there are 4 judges who interrogate him at various points. And sometimes that's very down-to-earth questioning, but sometimes it becomes extremely legalistic and seems to be, is this really Humphrey Chimde we're talking about, or is this some great mythical character from history? And so it's confusing in that way. But then if I carry on with the simple plot, Humphrey Chimde has a wife who's called Anna Livia Plurabelle, and her middle name Livia kind of suggests the River Liffey, which is the river that runs through Dublin. And Humphrey Chimde and Anna Livia Plurabelle live in Chapelizod, which is right on the River Liffey, right next to Phoenix Park in Dublin. So they're the husband and wife, and then they have 2 twin sons, Shem and Sean, and a daughter, Isabel. Now, if you've read any other Joyce, if people come to this having already, read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is kind of an autobiography of Joyce, and a fictionalized autobiography, or if you've read Ulysses particularly, which is all about Dublin. Everything Joyce writes is about Dublin and Dubliners. And Finnegan's Wake is the same. It's all about Dublin. So Shem and Sean, the 2 boys who are the sons, in a way represent James Joyce himself, that's Shem, and his brother Stanislaus, who is Sean. And they're polar opposites, because James Joyce was an artist, a rebel. He left Dublin to go and live in Europe. He was adventurous. And Sean stayed behind. Stanislaus was his brother's name. And he's a more respectable character, a less adventurous character. And there's a little bit of animosity between the 2. Sean thinks that Shem was a complete sham. This is repeatedly given to us in the book. So in a way, it's Joyce talking about himself again. But then above all that, there's a whole other edifice, because Joyce said that the book was really a kind of dream. And in fact, was the dream of Finn McCool, the mythical giant, who mythically can be seen in Dublin itself, because his head is Horth Hill, which stands above Dublin Bay. His belly is the city of Dublin itself, and his feet rise in the hills beyond. And it's as though he is a sleeping giant, and this dream is Finnegan's Wake. So he's dreaming about Irish history, he's dreaming about politics, he's dreaming about philosophy, and all these things get mixed in together. And I'll stop with this. The title of it, because you could go on forever with these kind of cycles within cycles, and Joyce loves to, as in Ulysses, Ulysses is about one day in Dublin, but it's also about Homer's Odyssey. It's 24 hours, but it's also this enormous journey. And with Finnegan's Wake, it's the same. It's about a very specific thing in Dublin, but it's also about the whole history of Ireland. And the title comes from a song, Finnegan's Wake, which is an old 19th century Irish-American ballad, which describes a guy called Tim Finnegan, who was a hod carrier. He helped builders by carrying bricks on a hod up to the builder so that the builder could lay the bricks. That's his job. But he had a slight failing, which was he loved liquor. And one morning he's rather drunk and he falls from the ladder and breaks his skull. So they carry him home and they have a wake, they have a party, a fight develops, a bottle of whiskey strikes the wall, the whiskey falls onto the dead Tim, who then revives and says, "Ah, to the devil, do you think I'm dead?" And this becomes a kind of metaphor, the fall of man. He falls from the ladder, this thing that happens, this event, and then a revival. And all through the book, we have this idea of things falling with a great thud or a thunderstroke. And I think you'll hear Barry read a bit of the book in a minute, in which he encounters one of the famous 100-letter words, which are thunderstrokes. And these this thunderstroke is kind of Tim falling from the ladder, or it's the fall of man. So you can see how it's incredibly complex. And because the book is episodic and all the chapters are very different, you just can't follow this through in a straight line. You have to gradually assimilate all these different aspects of it. And it's a comedy. It's great fun.
Wow, that's a very impressive synopsis and giving us a sense of things. What do you think, Marcella? Did he miss anything?
I'll teach him afterwards all the things he missed. No, honestly, I sat back in admiration. I think that's quite a synopsis. It's impossible to do what Roger's just done. Fab.
Well, now, so we've talked a lot about, we've mentioned Dublin over and over. This was obviously extremely important in Joyce's life. And Barry, I'm told you live in the area where the book is set, and that you actually have a number of interesting connections to the text. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll have you do a short reading.
Well, I do live in Chapel Lizard. That's just by sheer chance. I didn't sort of plan to come here. I grew up in Sandymount, which of course features famously in Sandymount Strand in episode 3 of Ulysses. And I went to the same university, so there are similarities. I didn't go to the same school, but I was at a Catholic boarding school, but it wasn't run by the Jesuits. It was run by the Vincentians, and there is a Vincentian mentioned in Finnegan's Wake when the rumours go around about the ballad, which we may talk about later, that Percy Riley sings about Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker and his crime in the Phoenix Park. But Roger was talking about the what of the book there, but in a way it's the how that is so important, because anybody who comes to this book who's been used to reading normal books will freak out, because it is not like a normal book. It's like somebody who's listened to Mozart or classical music all their life and then suddenly is faced with The Rite of Spring or something. Well, the people at the time, The Rite of Spring seems quite normal to me now, but I'm sure in 1913 or whatever it was very strange. Or any sort of atonal music, Schoenberg or whatever, and that sort of second Viennese school. If they hear that, it's completely different to what they think as normal classical music. But all that matters is, as Roger said, is whether you enjoy it or not. And sometimes you have to get used to something and try it before you enjoy it. It's like taking a first drink. You mightn't like the first taste of whiskey, but it can become very, or gin or whatever it is, it can become very nice after a while, which can be very dangerous too. But the book is written a bit like, it delves its language from many, many languages. It's basically English. A famous theatre director here in Ireland, Hilton Edwards, who co-founded the Gate Theatre with Michael McLean, was once told that Finnegan's Wake had been translated into Swedish. And he said, "From what?" Which kind of sums it up. Do you want me to read the opening page, just to give you an example? Now, this is pretty difficult stuff, because the opening chapter was written not at the beginning. It was written halfway through the writing of the book. And it sums up a lot of themes that you won't get in the first hearing. But in a way, one of the most important things about Finnegan's Wake is the music, the sound of it. So if you have the text in front of you and are listening to a recording, whether this or any other one, if somebody reads it well, then you should get more out of it, because there are many, many ways of pronouncing a lot of the words that are not normal words, as we would call them in English. So anyway, I'll give you the first page and we'll see how it goes. And yes, the first of the 1,000 letter words is there somewhere. You'll know it when you hear it. River run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious ficus of recirculation back to Howth, Castle and environs. Sir Tristram, Viler de Mores, for over the short sea, at Pasoncourt re-arrived from North Armorica, on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor, to wielder fight his peninsulate war. Nor had topsoil's rocks by the stream of Coney exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County's Gorgios, while they went doubling their mumper all the time. Nor a voice from afar bellows Misha Misha to Tauf Tauf Thuart Petrick. Not yet, though very soon after, had the kidscat butt-ended a bland old Isaac. Not yet, though all's fair in vanity, where Sosie Sester's wroth with Tuan, Nathan Joe. Rot a peck of paws malt had gem or shen brewed by arclight, and Riordan to the Regenbrow was to be seen ringsome on the aqua face. The fall, Babara dalgara takamina ron con bron twanat ron twan ton trova run onscon tuhu hurden enternuk, of a once Wall Street old par is retailed early in bed and later on life down through all Christian minstrelsy. The great fall of the off-wall entailed at such short notice the shoot of Finnegan, Earth's solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his tumty-tum toes, and their upturned pike point and place is at the knock out in the park, where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first loved Livy.
Fantastic. You definitely are, giving us a sense of how challenging this book could be reading it with your eyes. I know I looked at that text and there was no way that I could have gotten through it, but when I hear you say it, it makes sense. It comes to life. And so I would love for you to give us some insights in how did you, get your mouth around all of this, and how did you, give context to the words?
Well, with great difficulty at times, and at other times, one of the great pluses on my being asked to do it was the fact that I got this book for my 21st birthday. Just showed you what a nerd I was then. I got some other stuff as well, but I wanted to try because I'd come across, I'd read Portrait at school, and I'd come across parts of I wouldn't have read the full Ulysses at the time, I don't think, although I did read it in my early 20s. But I'd heard about the Finnegan's Wake. So all through my life, I've gone into bits and pieces of it and annotated it and read little bits about it. So I had some knowledge of it. But some years ago, I was over in Los Angeles doing a play, not a film, ironically. And I had time on my hands. And I said this year, I think it was 2016 or whatever, I said, I'm going to read it from the beginning, River Run, to the final, the. So I did that year, not just over in LA, but at home here in Dublin as well. And it took me many, many months, maybe the guts of a year to get through it, because I just had concentration a few pages a day. And of course, a lot of it made no sense to me, but I got a drift of the whole music of the world of Finnegan's Wake, and about and there's still lots I don't know about it. I mean, I'm just the reader. I don't need to know everything. But a couple of things are of advantage to both Marcella and to me, because we're both from Dublin. I'm not saying somebody from Japan or Iceland or New Zealand can't do it better than we can. They may well be able to. But there is something about, there are basic, not only Irish, but Dublin things laced through the text that only a Dubliner could possibly know, unless you came and lived here and so on. There are things that are so local to our culture that's one thing I can bring to it. I'm sure I've made many errors, and then who can say what an error is in Finnegan's Wake sometimes, I had to work at it, obviously, for months, knowing that I was going to do the recording. And I just did the best I could. And I annotated it with a pencil, and some of the very long words, the sort of portmanteau words, a bit like what Lewis Carroll uses in Jabberwocky in Oz Through the Looking Glass. I was able to kind of, for instance, the 100-letter words, I was able to divide them up into sections, into syllables, 2 or 3 syllables at a time. And they all actually mean something. That's all. The one I have there was all to do with thunder in many different languages. And there are other ones to do with coughing and various other things. So that's the way I worked on it bit by bit. And we had a wonderful producer in Roger, and a wonderful sound engineer in Jared in the studio. So that was a great help to me, and we just battled on as best we could.
Well, it sounds like they were very lucky that you happened to be studying this title on your own as well.
Well,
because
you have to. You can't just go into it not knowing. I mean, I knew a lot of the main themes in the book, and a lot of the themes are in that section I read at the beginning, which you couldn't possibly know about now, like things to do with Jonathan Swift and things to do with Jem or
Lewis
Shen,
Carroll,
in reference to the sons of Noah and so on and so forth,
yeah.
which come up in the book. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say Lewis Carroll is another big thing that keeps cropping up. Alice in Wonderland and Humpty Dumpty, who fell off a wall, of course.
Yeah, well, of course, when it was being advertised before it came out, there were a couple of rhymes. One of them was Humpty Dump Dublin squeaks through his Norse. Humpty Dump Dublin hath a horrible vorse. And with all his kinks English and his Iris Manx brogues, Humpty Dump Dublin's granddada of all rogues. So there was one of them.
So Roger, I would say, I mean, obviously this book is such a challenge, and it seems like some of it doesn't even necessarily make sense. How do you, get through it when in those situations?
I think it all makes sense, but you really have to work to get at that sense. And, I absolutely agree with Barry. You probably never quite get to the bottom of it. I mean, I thought I knew Finnegan's Wake pretty well, but then with Barry in the studio, I was learning stuff every single day because of what Barry has said, because of, local knowledge, and because Barry has studied quite a, there's reams of scholarship on this. There are probably more scholars for this than, well, I think Joyce actually was up there with Christ, Karl Marx, and Wagner as one of the most written about. I don't know if he still is, but there's loads of stuff out there. And with the best will in the world, you can't read it all, but there are answers to all the questions if you just dig hard enough. So we had a lot of fun sorting things out. And I agree with Barry, there are lots of bits that we probably never quite got to the bottom of. But I also agree with Barry that quite often it doesn't matter, that you get the general gist and you're swept along by the language and you get to the end of it feeling, that sounded great, that felt great, I kind of know what was going on, and you move on.
It's fascinating. Now, Marcella, you've actually read Joyce before, notably Molly Bloom's soliloquy in Ulysses. And when it came to reading Anna in this, did that all help your previous Joyce experience, or was it a totally different challenge?
Oh, totally different challenge. They're two very different kinds of women as well. I mean, also the fact that Ulysses is a day book, and so everything that Molly talks about, for instance, when she goes into reveries and when she talks about her past, it's very rooted. Whereas with Anna Livia, because she is so many different things, she's a river, she's a mother, she's everything, and it dips in and out. It's also dreamlike. So it heads off into other areas altogether. But I can't second enough what both of them have said about that thing where you're reading it and reading it and thinking, I really can't understand this, but there's something in Joyce about his extraordinary sense of rhythm. And back to what Barry said about being a Dubliner, and I don't know if it's that or just him being brilliant. If you just follow his rhythms somehow, it kind of clicks in your head, and you might not fully understand it, and then you can go back and have a look at it again. And I think for anybody who's thinking of reading it, if they're against audiobooks, for instance, because some people say, well, you get the interpretation from the point of view of the actor. Yes, absolutely, of course you do. But with this particular book, because of those rhythms and because of the understanding of certain things that you can't get, for instance, if you're Japanese or Iranian or American, they'll suddenly sort of fall into place. And I found them fantastic and terrifying, I have to say as well. At one stage, I list, I think it's over 100 presents, right? And it's this massive list, hilariously funny, this massive list of presents, right? And I felt it was kind of like a horse cantering along, one of those. And I thought, I'm not so sure I should be doing it like this. I'm going to try to change that rhythm a bit or something. And I fell down a big fat hole, because you really absolutely have to follow his rhythms. You're totally lost if you don't. And the only thing I found at that particular section was the galloping got a bit too fast at one stage, and I had to pull myself back because my mouth was moving faster than my brain. And I think that's actually got to do with the rhythmical sense of the book. That's why it makes such a good listen, I think, as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I needed that assist as an American to understand, the pronunciation of the words, but also to understand what the meaning of the word is. So
Yeah.
now we've had a little reading from Barry. I'd love to invite you to read a bit from the text at the end.
Oh, right. This is the very end, right. I am passing out. Oh, bitter ending. I'll slip away before they're up, They'll never see, nor know, nor miss me. And it's old and old. It's sad and old. It's sad and weary. I go back to you, my cold father, my cold, mad father, my cold, mad, fiery father, till the near sight of the mere size of him, the moils and moils of it moan and owning, makes me sea silt salt sick, and I rush my only into your arms. I see them rising. Save me from those terrible prongs. 1, 2 more men's more. So, Ave Laval. My leaves have drifted from me all, but one clings still. I'll bear it on me to remind me of the so soft this morning hours. Yes, carry me along, Taddy, like you done through the toy fair. If I seen him bearing down on me now under white spread wings, like he's come from archangels, I think I'll die down over his feet, humbly dumbly, only to wash up. Yes, Tid, there's where. First, we pass through grass, they hush the bush to. A gull. Gulls. Far calls. Coming far. Finn here. Us then. Finn again. Take. But softly remember me till thousands thee. The keys to. Given. Away, alone, a last, a loved, a longed.
Well, that final line, it ends that mid-sentence, no stop, and it links up.
It links up because one of the things that Joyce was very fond of, there was an 18th century philosopher called Vico from Naples, and he believed in there were 4 ages. I think they were gods, heroes, humans, and then ricorso was the 4th age. And the ricorso was shorter than the other ages, and what it did was at the end of ricorso, it linked back up to the very beginning of the ages. And Joyce was very taken by that idea, and it spurred him on to think along those lines.
It's fantastic. There's so much detail in this text.
Yeah.
And I think you oftentimes don't get that. And it definitely felt like you all worked together as a team to uncover all the different layers and create something really fantastic.
Well, maybe psychically, when I was having trouble, I'd be thinking, God, Barry is going through this as well. We're all in this together. And I thank God for Roger. And I hope to God when I get into studio, he's not going to say, no, that's absolutely not right. So yes, I think we were thinking, well, I was certainly thinking of them while I was doing it, rehearsing it, I mean.
And I imagine that you miss that experience of being in the studio together and being able to collaborate with someone in that way.
Very much so. I think what we missed even more than that was the ability to just go for a drink after a recording session. I mean, I'm in France, Barry was in Dublin, with Marcella in London, and you get to the end of a day of doing this stuff and, you just want to go and sit and have a drink and probably talk about it, but we didn't have that luxury. Actually, I've never met Barry in the flesh. It's a weird thing. I feel I've got to know him really well, but we've never met in the flesh because apparently there's a pandemic around. I don't know. Yeah.
So Barry, did that prevent you from going and drinking in the same pubs as James Joyce had?
You couldn't get in because of the pandemic, and they were closed. The fact they've only opened this week in Dublin. They've just opened for serving outdoors. Yeah, I used to be wiped at the end of the day. It was as if I had just played a match against the All Blacks or something. Oh well, that's the New Zealand rugby team, in case you're wondering. And so I was physically and emotionally and mentally drained. And sometimes we just had to say, you know, there might have been another half an hour left to do. It was flexible time. Sometimes we'd go over if we were on a roll, but sometimes we just say, no, I've got to stop here or whatever. It just came to a natural end with your body and your mind. But I remember going home, and I didn't drive in. I took the bus because the bus goes fairly, you know, it was easy to take. And I used to get on the bus and I was wiped. And when I got home, I just wanted to either get into the shower or go to bed or something. And then I had to think, gosh, I've got to do 5 hours of this tomorrow. I have to prepare tomorrow's section. And the last thing on earth I wanted to do was that, read Joyce, or especially read Finnegan's Wake. But somehow, I mean that, you know the way I mean that. I just would have a meal and then I'd get down to it. And it became a sort of labor of love again. And one of the things about the book that I learned is that if you get the bug of wanting to learn and know more about the book, you may not be able to comprehend everything, but you may be able to apprehend a lot of things. And others not necessarily understand everything, but you get the drift. You get it more and more. And I think I certainly got it more and more as I went through it. And I think it's a bit like music in that sense, because music is the most abstract of all the arts. And in a way, this really approaches, to misquote Walter Pater, approaches the quality of music, you know, in some ways, more than anything else. I mean, all of Joyce. I know I've done a lot of Beckett as well, but Joyce and Beckett to me were both poets who wrote in prose. Mm-hmm. I mean, they did write some poetry as well, but Joyce is not a great poet, poet. But all his prose is poetic.
So, Roger, as a composer, I'd love for you to talk about the music a bit.
Well, I'd like to follow up on Barry's point first, because one of the difficulties with the book, and it's a difficulty that I suppose most people first encounter with Ulysses, when you read the final chapter, that amazing soliloquy of Molly Bloom's, it's absolutely wonderful. When you hear Marcella reading it, it just sounds natural. But when you look at it on the page, there are however many pages, 60 pages or something, with no punctuation. No punctuation. I know nobody taught James Joyce punctuation or something. Well, Finnegan's Wake, you know, has yards and yards of that with no punctuation, or punctuation which is so minimal that it doesn't help you. And some of the sentences are so long. So you have to work out the punctuation, or in musical terms, the phrasing. And when you find the phrasing, sometimes the difficulties just fall away. Ah, that's what it is. If we break the sentence here, if we make a pause here, if we run this onto that, then suddenly it makes sense. So actually unpicking all that, we would get to the end of a day sometimes thinking, we're just not getting this. Something is not working. And we would go away and independently look at it. And sometimes I would come back with just commas and dashes. And if we do it like this, it will work. It's phenomenally difficult, which is why I think this audiobook is going to be so helpful to anybody that has the will to do Finnegan's Wake, but simply can't get through those impenetrable barriers.
Yes,
but music.
Can I just say, if you're listening, sorry, Roger, if you're listening to the book, it's in a way to let the book wash over you is one of the best ways, and not to try to sort of, when you're listening to it, I mean, and not to try and work it too hard, because if you just let it happen, really, and you can jump as well, it doesn't have to be linear. That I couldn't agree with Roger more there on that one.
But then music, you asked me a question about music. I mean, music in the book is incredibly important, not just the musicality of the book, which is a big part of it, but actual references to music. And that's true of all Joyce's work. And in fact, in Ulysses, you know, music is, Don Giovanni is as important in Ulysses as the Odyssey is. And the Flying Dutchman, you know, a big part of it. Joyce knew his music, and he knew classical music, and he knew folk music, and he knew popular music. And Dublin at the turn of the century was awash with music, including operas, and everybody knew them. And everybody had a piano in the house, and everybody sang. So, you know, music is absolutely embedded in the sort of Dublin soul, and Joyce had that, and he knew them all. So there are there is actual music in the book. There's a song which is called The Ballad of Pierce O'Reilly, which I think Barry might grace us with a little bit of soon, which is actually notated in musical notation by Joyce. He writes out the notes of the melody. And for a lot of readers, that probably washes right over your head. If you can't read the music or you don't spend time reading the music, you have no idea how this song is supposed to sound. And then you just read the however many verses there are, about 20 of them. It's very, very long. But of course, with the audiobook, Barry, who is a fabulous singer, sings the whole thing. So you get the whole goods from it. So there's that. But there's also lots of references to music. And for example, Wagner's Tristan and Isolde is a big thing because Isolde was Irish. You know, there's a tower, Isolde's Tower in Phoenix Park, and she was taken to England to marry King Mark by Tristan, and she fell in love with Tristan, and they did the love potion thing and they died. And this is a perfect kind of analogy to the sorts of things that Joyce is talking about in the book. So we get constant references to Tristan and Isolde, and sometimes he's referring to the very many versions of Tristan and Isolde which have worked through history from medieval times. You know, it's a very old story told in many different ways, but a lot of the time it's Wagner. And everybody knows Wagner. And Wagner is a really important composer, and Tristan is one of his most important works in musical terms because it was so experimental harmonically. And he plays on all of that. And the thing about Naxos is that Naxos, right from the beginning, have loved to use music with the audiobooks because Naxos is originally and still a music label. So when Naxos audiobooks started up, the idea was to introduce every chapter with a little bit of music from the Naxos catalog. And fortunately, I was able to get permission to do this with this audiobook. So every chapter is introduced by a bit of music, which is actually relevant to and mentioned usually in the text. And of course, Tristan and Isolde is there and lots of other things. But the other thing is all the Irish music, all the Irish songs, which a lot of which were unknown to me, but not to Barry. And so we'd be reading a page of text, and there would be a phrase which I thought was a lovely phrase, but I had no idea why it was there. And Barry would say, "Oh, now this is a song. Shall I sing it?" Really? Oh yeah, it's from the second verse of such as, you know, fantastic. So there's lots of music there, which normally he didn't sing it because it didn't quite work within the context, but sometimes he did. So there are all those things which I think for a normal reader are going to pass you by, which we've been able to draw out musically as well.
I think that's the perfect segue into Barry singing something for us.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of the Ballad of Pierce O'Reilly. It's got 14 verses and it is long. I'll give you maybe 4 of them or something like that. But let me reach to my piano. As he wrote it in A major, let's sing it in the right key. Have you heard of one Humpty Dumpty, how he fell with a roll and a rumble, and curled up like Lord Olaf a crumple by the butt of the magazine wall, hump helmet and all. He was one time our king of the castle, now he's kicked about like a rotten old parsnip, and from Green Street he be sent by order of his worship to the penal jail of Mountjoy. To the jail of Mountjoy, jail him and joy. He was father of all schemes for to bother us, slow coaches and immaculate contraceptives for the populace, mare's milk for the sick, 7 dry Sundays a week, open air love and religious reform, hideous in form. How wise as you couldn't he manage it? I'll go bail my fine dairyman darling, like the bumping bull of the Cassidys. All your butter is in your horns, his butter's in his horns, butter his horns, and so on.
Fabulous. I continue to be amazed by how each of your personal knowledge and personal talents in different ways are really added to this recording. It's something fantastic. Now, we do have a couple questions from the audience in the sky, as it were. If you, as an audience member on Zoom, have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. So this is for our narrators. Marcella, let's start with you. Yeah. In addition to the challenge of conveying Joyce's language, can you please describe the experience of performing the book to an audience that really isn't there, as opposed to just, speaking into the microphone, because you're trying to perform it, not just read it.
Yeah. An awful lot of it takes place inside my head, actually. Do you know what I mean? And you're also working on the challenge of the pronunciation of it. So that's a factor. But also, even though you're in front of a microphone, it's a bit like when you're on the telephone. You are aware there is a person at the other end, hopefully listening to you. And so as against being, say, in a big theatre and having an enormous audience, I'm aware of the one singular person who's listening to it. That's what works for me.
What about you, Barry? Do you find it a little different to perform here, knowing that there are more people watching you than just Roger?
Oh, you mean here and now?
Yeah.
Not really. No, I just imagine there's just the four of us. I don't. That's probably you've put the markers on it now for me.
Sorry.
Probably the Finnegan's Wake experts watching now who would be questioning things we'd say, but that's fine because that's what it's all about. And sorry, I'm rocking the table. No, I think you just get on with it. Look, you could never finish this book if you didn't just get on with it. And each day we had to try and do so many pages a day because we had a deadline. So I just got on with it and tried to enjoy it as best I could. I think we had a couple of days later on when we had some pickups for some obvious errors or maybe a phrase or rather a paragraph we felt, well, Roger felt perhaps I could do better. And there were lots of these, but with only a certain amount of time. But no matter how many times you do it, it's only one performance. It's like a musical live performance. You do it differently the next day. There's never perfect. You're aiming at some sort of perfection, which never actually arrives. That's all you can do.
All right. People are talking about how much they loved Ulysses, and they want to know if you'd recommend following along with the text of Finnegan's Wake while listening to the recording. Roger, what do you think?
I think that's a really good idea, but I don't think it's essential. You will certainly get more out of it if you follow the text, but I don't know. What do you think, Barry and Marcella? I'm not really sure about that.
I would be in favor. For me, if I were the punter, listening to a recording, because there are so many things that are visual and so many that are oral. So in a way, there are so many words that you could say in so many different ways, and they're all right ways of doing it. But you cannot get. To me, it's like a piano transcription of an orchestral score. You can play the notes, but they're not going to sound the same. If you've got a bassoon or a viola or a whatever, cello playing a certain thing, you can, on the piano, it's only going to sound like a piano. But so in a way, when you can see and hear it, you then say, oh yeah, that's such a I mean, there's one thing in the very beginning, I decided to pronounce Nathandjoe, Nathan Joe, because it's like to do with Jonathan Swift. And there's references then to Sosie, Sester's, Roth. I mean, that's perhaps Susanna, Esther, and Ruth in the Old Testament. We don't have to go into that. But Nathan Joe rather than Nathan Joe. Now, Nathan would be equally correct, but Jonathan, Nathan Joe. I mean, probably people won't get that. But for instance, a viola d'amores, there's a viola d'amore, an instrument. There's the violator of loves, there's all sorts of ways you could say that. You could say passencore, you say passencore. It's just penisolate, is it fighting with his penis or is it fighting with, is it the peninsular war is obviously there. So there's all that. So you have to make decisions all the time. And that's all you can do. But one of the American things in the opening page is by the stream of Coney. And I had the pleasure of being in Georgia a few years ago. I was doing some readings at Beckett there. And I had a lovely walk one day in Athens, Georgia, down by the River Oconee. I wanted to go to Dublin, which is 200 miles away, but I didn't have the time. But there you go. So Dublin, Georgia is referred to on page 1 of Finnegan's Wake.
So now here's a fun question. Did you or will you enjoy and understand Finnegan's Wake more if you read it while drunk or while sober?
Read it or listen to it? Read it or listen to it?
Well, it's reading with your eyes or your ears, I think, either way.
I wouldn't recommend reading it drunk. You could listen to it drunk, probably sound great, yeah. But I think, yeah, back to Tim Finnegan again. Tell him and thou, do you think I'm dead? Yeah. I don't know.
So, Marcella, what's the challenge
I
of...
wouldn't recommend reading it, but back to your previous question, whether you should listen and read at the same time, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't. I agree with everything Barry said there. There's no reason why you shouldn't do little sections of it. And then after you've heard it on the CDs, stop them and try reading it for yourself. You know what I mean? To see, because you might disagree with what you've just heard, and that's good too.
It's a fascinating scholarly challenge there to, compare the words and the sounds and the choices that you've all made, because you've had to make so many intimate and little tiny detailed ones.
Yes.
So, Marcella, what's the challenge of pronouncing all these words in so many different languages?
Practice, 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 really. And I fell down many rabbit holes while I was trying to figure out, was that Danish or was that, Norwegian or something. And also another rabbit hole I fell down was trying to get all the senses into it and make it clear. And that really isn't going to work. So you just have to plump for one and hope for the best, really. Just practice, practice, practice. That's all.
So now, Barry, we're going to bring your knowledge of Beckett and Joyce together a little. So this person says they're told that Beckett assisted Joyce in his research for this book, and once or twice Joyce even dictated a little bit to Beckett. Can you talk about the differences and similarities in their style, and do you actually hear any of Beckett in Finnegan's Wake?
Well, yes and no. I'll tell you what I mean by that. Beckett was completely different to Joyce. Beckett once said Joyce tried to put everything in, and I tried to take everything out.
Yes.
He did assist Joyce for a while. He wasn't his secretary, as is often mentioned, but he did assist him with certain things. And he actually helped to translate An Olivia Pluribel, chapter 8, which Marcella does. And it wasn't published. He didn't. It was published in French by another writer, but he did work on it. There's a famous story that somebody once knocked at the door when he was dictating to Beckett, and so there was a knock, you see, and Joyce said, "Come in," and then whatever happened went. And when Beckett read back the piece that Joyce had dictated, Joyce stopped him. He said, "What's that? Come in?" And he said, "Well, that's what you said." And he said, let it stand. Now, it's not in the book. I've never been able to find it, and greater Joycean scholars than I, as far as I know, have not been able to find it. Although there are one or two places where I don't have the page here. I'm not going to look through the 628 pages now, but there's a scene where they're talking about the so-called crime in the Phoenix Park, where he talks about Humphrey Chimpton Earwick or whatever guys he's in at this stage. I think it's the Russian general and so on. He's wiping himself after defecating with a piece of turf, and it's an insult to old Ireland or something like that in Finnegan's words. And Buckley is about to shoot the Russian general, but because he had his trousers down, he was decent about it and didn't shoot him. This is the story that goes through it. It comes from Joyce's father. And there's a thing there, there's a phrase there that Beckett is alleged to have said to Joyce, and that's in there. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's quite possible. It's a good story anyway.
Well, we have one person who says he regards Finnegan's Wake as a territory with highly complex geography and imagines its reader as a wanderer who must keep moving to encounter those that will guide and help him on his journey through the book. So, Marcella, we'll start with you, but I'll ask this for each of you. How do you see Finnegan's Wake?
Of course, that's a very good description. Actually, you actually are channeling everything like that. I mean, it is after all a dream, So you are going through all sorts of gates and strangenesses and everything. So yes, that's actually, I completely agree with everything said there. Yeah, definitely.
What about you, Barry? Especially, being in that area, how do you see
Well, it
Finnegan's
sounds
Wake?
like Dante, doesn't it? Virgin there and the journey. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've lost my train of thought. What was the question again? Sorry.
So how do you see Finnegan's Wake? He's imagining it with this complex geography and,
Well, one of the things about geography is, though, even though, you said and they say it's set in Chapel Lizard, this village that I live in here in the outskirts, well, just a few miles from Dublin, it is and it isn't. I mean, it's universal. It's about the world. It's about the history of the world. It's about wars. It's Napoleon and Wellington. Brutus and Cassius come in under Latin names, Burrus and Casius, butter and cheese at one stage. It's very complex. So it's about all the things in the world. So the geography of it really is set everywhere. It's not, but towards the end of the book, we get to know that the proprietor, Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker and Anna Livia Plurabelle, that their more earthly names are Mr. and Mrs. Porter, and they live with their twin sons and their daughter in allegedly the Mullingar Inn, which is only 100 yards behind me here. Like, if it's open, I might go up and have a pint after this.
Perfect.
That is their home and so on. But as Marcella said, it's a kind of dream world. Now, whether it's an actual dream, there are scholars who differ about this, but it's certainly a book of the night, whereas Ulysses was a book of the day. So in a way, Joyce was able to write about everything and anything in all their manifestations by making it a book of the night and making it dreamlike.
What about you, Roger? Anything to add on to all of that?
I think the question is a very good one. I think it's a question about structure. And it's interesting that Barry just mentioned Dante, because I think Dante is absolutely germane to this. The Divine Comedy is also a dream, and it's an immense edifice. It's perfectly structured. It's 3 huge books of 100 cantos each, I think, or 33 each, and 34 in the last, so it makes 100 overall. And it's absolutely structured. And like Finnegan's Wake, you can't read Dante's Divine Comedy without a lot of notes beside you. And the scholars started providing notes for the Divine Comedy about 10 years after he published it. People have always needed help to understand that, and people will always need help to understand Finnegan's Wake. And Joyce wanted that. He spent 17 years writing it. As Barry said, he tried to put everything into it, and he wanted us all to be studying it for hundreds of years. But the other books that come to mind are Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, who gets a mention quite a few times in Finnegan's Wake because of the Tristram thing, I guess, but also because Joyce was very, very keen on Lawrence Sterne. And Tristram Shandy is amazing structurally because it's constant digressions. It starts out telling the life of Tristram Shandy, doesn't even get to his birth till about chapter 25, because constantly, every time he says something, he does a digression somewhere. And the other thing is Alice in Wonderland. And Lewis Carroll had a stutter, just like Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker has a stutter. And Marcella's talked about going down rabbit holes. That's a very good expression for this, because this book is always referring to Alice in Wonderland, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, Humpty Dumpty, etc. And those books are, they're the 3 I've mentioned are not straightforward books. They're not just storybooks. And Joyce aspired to that. He wanted to create something that was this incredible edifice that you would have to pick your way through or wander through, as your questioner has said. That's a great question. I think it's absolutely right.
Fantastic. Well, I feel like we really have 3 excellent guides on this journey as we listen. And we'll take one final question. Marcella, this is for you. Mm-hmm. When did you first read and get to know Finnegan's Wake? Did you know it before you read Ulysses? No,
and it's very interesting, and I feel ashamed of myself because Barry talked about how he tried to address it all those years ago. I never, ever did. And the first time was when Roger asked me to do the abridged version when we recorded that. I mean, there were bits of it that I was aware of. Inevitably, you become aware of bits of it or half stories about it. But I'd never, ever, ever sat down to read the novel. And I think in a way, I'm a hope for anybody who's thinking of addressing it now. And if they listen to the audiobook as well, they can get ahead of the game. If I was me now as against, you know, if I was trying to do it all over again, I would do it that way actually. But yes, I never looked at it.
Fascinating to come from two different perspectives on this.
I didn't think I'd be able for it actually, is the fact of the matter. I thought it would defeat me. And so when I was given the challenge of reading it, I thought, oh my God. And then thought, just batten down the hatches and address this. It can't be that hard. Whoops.
Well, we are glad you did. So I want to thank Marcella and Roger and Barry for speaking to us today and giving us these insights into this really fantastic recording. I encourage people to go out and read it with your ears. I'd like to thank the staff of AudioFile for pulling all of this together, and of course to the audience for joining us and providing these fantastic questions. And to everyone at the Joyce Center, happy Bloomsday 2021 tomorrow. Thank you for helping bring all of this together. And of course, thank you to Naxos Audiobooks, who's the publisher of Finnegan's Wake and who sponsored today's event. Just a reminder, the video will be available on our YouTube channel by early next week. And if you like what you heard here today, please visit audiofilemagazine.com for audiobook reviews and recommendations, and follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. We have Behind the Mic as one podcast and Audiobook Break. Behind the Mic recommends a new audiobook every weekday, and Audiobook Break is giving us chapter by chapter David Copperfield. It's an extra special listening experience read by Nicholas Bolton and published again by Naxos Audiobooks. Thank you all. I'm seeing some wonderful thank yous into the chat box, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon and evening. And Barry, I hope you go to the pub and get a pint in honor of all we have talked about here today. Thank you and have a good night.